The speed with which this became a stick with which to beat the media, or an opportunity for people to sound off about their favourite talking points about Britain being a institutionally racist country, all the hacked off lobby suddenly popping up once again, never letting a good tragedy go to waste, to say that now is the time to regulate the press more broadly. I think it's absolutely outrageous.
I cannot believe people think that the responsible thing to do is to live in a less free society where free speech is under attack and where people are being unable to do their jobs, or having the Metropolitan Police saying, hey, stop looking into this case. I don't think that benefits anyone.
Towards the end of the sort of news cycle, the allegations had moved not just from allegations of plagiarism, but actual academic fraud, the falsification of data.
Hello and welcome to the Spike podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me in the studio we have Spike's editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And joining us down the line we have one of our returning favourite guests, Esther Krakue. Welcome back.
Thank you.
So today we're mostly going to be focusing on the tragedy of Jason Arday. But if you join us over on Spike Podcast Unlocked afterwards, if you're a Spike supporter, you can listen to that. We'll be discussing the early prisoner release scheme and the wildfire alerts as well. So a vigil has been held this week for Jason Arday, the Cambridge professor who tragically died on Friday. He'd been subject of a great deal of media and public interest. This week, the commentary has taken a rather sour turn, I think it's fair to say. A lot of people have actually blamed the media for his death, effectively calling it a racist lynching simply because there was lots of reporting on his case. Tom, what have you made of that reaction?
I think it's outrageous to despicable, to be perfectly honest. I mean, when news broke of Jason Arday's death, as far as we know from his own hand, of course, everyone was horrified, shocked. Your heart went out to his family and friends and close colleagues. But the speed with which this became a stick with which to beat the media, or an opportunity for people to sound off about their favourite talking points about Britain being a institutionally racist country, all the hacked off lobby suddenly popping up once again, never letting a good tragedy go to waste, to say that now is the time to regulate the press more broadly. I think it's absolutely outrageous, and I don't think we should resile from talking about that. Very quickly, the narrative has been cast that Jason Arday was effectively killed. I mean, the language from Lord Woolley at the Vigil yesterday, which I attended, was that he was assassinated and lynched. This is simply untrue, and I think it's really important that we do not allow this moment to sort of rewrite very recent history, because I only see the consequence of that being that we obscure the conversation that we should have about how the Jason Arday story came to the point that it did, why we ever got into a position where someone was able to plagiarise and lie their way to such a point of public importance. They almost became a kind of prisoner of their own fantasy land, were kind of put on a pedestal by institutions like Cambridge, to which they were always going to be knocked off. And the other consequence is going to be a less free media, a media that is more cowed, a media that is told that if you criticise or even just expose the wrongdoing, alleged wrongdoing of public figures, then you are responsible if they end up making the worst and most final of decisions. This is a horrendous precedent to set, and I think just because we find ourselves once again in the middle of a sort of BLM style mania, people are allowing the kind of standards that we would normally hold the media to, the principles that we would usually stick to when discussing these issues, just completely go out the window. So I think it's really important, in particular, that media organisations stick up for themselves and be, of course, sensitive to what has just happened. How could you not, as a human being, but not allow yourselves and your industry to be smeared off of the back of it for politically motivated reasons?
Absolutely. And Esther, I mean, in order to paint this case as an example of racism or racist lynching, people have tried to essentially say that Jason Arday was not an important public figure, that this is not a story of public interest, and that he didn't really do anything wrong anyway, so what's all the fuss about? I mean, none of that is true or justified, right?
The takeaway from this really tragic situation cannot be that we should not or cannot have a free press, or that journalists cannot do their job, or that you shouldn't report on certain stories because of how it will look. And I'm aware that in the heat of this tragedy, I think people's emotions are heightened, and so the kind of rational thought goes out of the room because it's really tragically sad. I try to give a kind of a different perspective as someone who's obviously works in British media, but who's worked particularly from the News UK building, which I'm sure you've been to. And so there are all sorts of publications in there. There's HarperCollins, there's Times, there's Talk TV, there's all of these. And I remember, like a few years ago, a few of my journalist friends, stuff like that, were talking about the Philip Schofield story before it broke. So everyone who is kind of like works in the media and is in the know knew of the Philip Schofield like debacle probably about 18 months before it actually broke. Like the story broke and everyone knew about it. And I remember talking to my friends and was saying when this story breaks out, one, it's going to be huge, but also I think he should leave the country and turn off his phone because he is going to be so bombarded because it will be the story of the time. Like we knew it. Like, there were so many things that happened before and like, journalists were chomping at the bits to do that. And I said, when the Jason Arday story broke, I think my personal immediate focus was how could Cambridge allow this? Like, I didn't even think we needed to know his name. I was like, the actual story of it for me, if I had to give like a corresponding analogy, was imagine if I was a South Korean man from Jeju Island and I claimed to be the Queen of Sheba. And Harvard gave me a job as the head of Queen of Shebiology. And I was teaching undergraduates who had worked very hard to get into Harvard. And I had now become like sort of the leading expert in Queen of Shebiology. And I said that the ire and the anger would be towards Harvard because clearly they're taking the piss. And I, as the Queen of Sheba, would be seen as someone who was obviously like dishonest, but I don't think there would have been as much public anger and ire. I do think that the focus from actually Cambridge and their lack of due diligence onto Jason Arday and himself personally, like stories about like trying to find his students and all of that, I think that distorted a lot of the coverage. And a lot of people were thinking like, okay, this man lie to get a job. Like, what about Rachel Reeves? We don't know the ins and outs of her CV, and all of these people and all of these prominent people that we know have lied on their CV. I think it's really kind of gross and sad and disgusting that the takeaway from this is let's not have a free press and let's have closed off conversations and let's hound journalists who are doing their job. I think it's not being able to look at the ecosystem because I'm going to be generous here and say they're clouded by grief or whatever. I think it's a real disservice to him. The media is still an economy. I was saying if I was a newspaper editor and I ran a front page saying man lies on CV to get a job, I'd be fired because that's not the kind of stuff that would sell papers generally. People think it's not in the public interest. The real scandal here was Cambridge, and he was the leading story. And I think two things can be right at the same time. This was a topic of public interest, and I think journalists should and absolutely should do their jobs in the public interest. You can't cherry pick what it was, but I think the focus unfortunately, and I think wrongly, moved from Cambridge and their lack of due diligence and their desire for this sort of fairy tale story to be true so badly. And for people who are already sick to the back teeth of DEI, who are sick of seeing stories like the Ministry of Defense having to pay out compensation for discriminating against white men who try to join the armed forces. They were so sick to the back teeth of these kinds of stories happening that they kind of latched onto this idea like, oh, look, DEI is so rotten. It gets to the heights of institutions like Cambridge. And I think those two things can be true at once. I cannot believe people think that the responsible thing to do is to live in a less free society where free speech is under attack and where people are being unable to do their jobs or having the Metropolitan Police saying, hey, stop looking into this case. I don't think that benefits anyone. But at the same time, I do think the coverage of Jason Arday, I don't think it, especially towards the last 2 weeks, served in the public's interest. I think there was kind of like, and people are not saying this, a lot of the stories actually crawling through his CV and his qualifications were from The Guardian. So this idea that this was mainly like a right-wing sort of onslaught, I just think it was a media ecosystem doing what a media ecosystem does. Basically piranhas after a piece of meat. And this man, unfortunately, was caught in the middle of it. I think, to be honest, I think to begin with, I don't think, when I read the allegations, I was like, he might as well have claimed he was the Queen of Sheba. Like, it was so ridiculous. Like, the marathons, the money he raised, the things he said. He didn't talk and, like, read and write until he was 18. I'm like, sir, come on now. But it didn't stir up ire in me because if someone came up to me and said, Esther, I'm Tutankhamun, I'm like, well, you should probably use some cream on your face because you probably have dry skin. Like,
But the tone of it, I think, was, it wasn't harsh or cruel. It was, look at what Mr. Arday said now, and that there was a new absurd fantasy day, day in, day out. Each day a new thing would be revealed. And as you said, the Guardian did a really good job on uncovering some of that. New York Times, the Atlantic, it's by no means a right wing thing at all.
Yes, it's difficult though, because on the one hand, I don't think you can expose the depths of Cambridge's poor decision making, the extent to which they allowed politics or the diktats of DEI to overcome basic common sense as well as academic standards, without also talking about the claims he'd made about himself and the fact that they were false. I think it is also worth saying that Jason Arday was someone who looked for the public spotlight. He wanted to be not just a professor at Cambridge doing his work, but also to be a kind of a public figure. He would give interviews to the mainstream media. He was profiled on Good Morning America. He did have this massive advance for a big memoir, which we assume is still coming out, although in what form we're not entirely clear. So it's one of those things where this is someone who did put themselves forward as a public figure, as well as being an example of a system that had gone horrendously wrong.
But again, that is Cambridge's fault. That goes back, like, why are you spotlighting this person?
I do understand that, and I think, but you can't separate out the parts. And to be honest with you, I think there part of the reasons that the story went on and on and on is not simply because it got more ridiculous. It's also because it got more concerning from Cambridge's perspective. Towards the end of the sort of news cycle, the allegations had moved not just from allegations of plagiarism, but actual academic fraud, the falsification of data, taking interviews, quotes that he had claimed had been taken himself by interviewing his subjects, but from elsewhere, then actually taking those quotes, putting different names on them and putting them in different papers. This is like amongst the most serious academic offences one can commit. So part of the reason the story went on and on and on is because of the fact that, yes, was there was some of them were entertaining, but also because they became more and more serious. But I think the problem now is that, if anything, the focus is more off Cambridge than it was previously, because the press have become the panto villain in all of this. Any discussion about why Cambridge didn't do the basic due diligence, also why they kind of stuck by him, not just over the course of the past couple of weeks, but really over the past couple of years, have been completely lost by the wayside. Even, to be honest, and this is something that we don't know and we can only really speculate about, questions of duty of care in the last few weeks. All of that has been eclipsed by the narrative, which is that Jason Arday was a black professor minding his business at Cambridge, when for some reason the press got out of bed the wrong side one morning and decided to get him because they hated the idea of there being a black professor at Cambridge. And as particularly when it comes down to the full details that have come out about this now, this is not an original point, but I think it's one that's really important to make. If this story could have ended very differently, let's put it that way. Concerns about Jason Arday were being raised quietly years ago. David Harris, who's a professor emeritus, who was sending letters to academic journals, to Cambridge itself, saying, "I've had a look at this guy's record and there's some things there I think you should want to know." Not only was he ignored, he had the police called on him.
Yeah.
You had Jack Grove at the Times Higher Education, who again was looking into this 2024, I think, maybe 2025, long before this became a big sort of social media story in the past few weeks. As we know, he got a legal letter from Carter, which scared his editors enough for him to stop pursuing the story, and also had the police called on him. So with the idea that journalists now are to blame, journalists in the end did their job because Cambridge and all the other institutions that Jason Arday came into contact with didn't do theirs. And it's also, there's something just, aside from it just being untrue, there's also something quite dangerous about going around suggesting that when someone takes their own life, as Jason Arday did, that is the fault of people for criticising them. That's like a really ugly and, as I say, unfounded claim to make in this particular situation. And I really do think the press have got to stick up for themselves. And I mean, if no one, as I say, feeling person should miss the fact that at the end of the day, there is a human being, family, friends, and what have you. But that doesn't mean, as we've all been saying, that therefore people aren't fair game for scrutiny, criticism, particularly when they become public figures. We've got to maintain that line very brightly, I think.
And institutions apparently are not fair game for scrutiny. I mean, Mary Beard, who's a professor at Cambridge, said explicitly in the wake of Jason Arday's death that now is the time to stop talking about Cambridge's policies, which is just an absolutely obscene thing to say. Now is the time, actually, to talk about what Cambridge has been up to, how it let this situation spiral out of control in the way that it did.
Like I said, the takeaway from this can't be we should have less free speech and that academic rigor doesn't matter and that standards don't matter. I think that's a horrifying and, quite honestly, bad faith argument to make. I think this idea that, a group of people, a group of journalists are responsible for one person killing themselves, then journalists will never be able to do their job because, the same kind of, you can level the same accusations at kind of any story that journalists have broken. I will say that the optics of this is extremely, extremely messy and unfortunate. So what I would like, and I'm trying to look at it from both sides. I'm trying to look at it from the perspective of people that I know, for example, like Enya Luko, who had that whole, was it Joey Barton, who started this kind of criticism of her punditry style, which then ended up in the courts for abuse and all of that. But the kind of vitriol that she got online, and all the kind of fury that comes with that. Obviously, we know football fans are very passionate, but that really crossed the line. And so, if you're someone like her and you are watching the situation of what looks like, I mean, just off the face of it, this professor, and I don't think he was targeted necessarily because he was black explicitly, because I know a lot of people that are journalists that worked on the story, and I don't think they're racist people. But if you look at it from that lens of the kind of coverage that he had, and you say, well, Rachel Reeves, who was our chancellor for 2 years, has a very, very sketchy CV, to say the least. I mean, for the 2 years that she was our chancellor, she was called Rachel from accounts because she blatantly lied. And I know journalists who are at the Independent and all of that, who were being also hounded in various more subtle ways to drop the kind of investigation into her qualifications until she had to come clean and say, yes, I misled my constituency on when I moved to Leeds, for example, and I got elected, and my experience as an economist and all of that. And so, like, and there's a lot of misinformation going on online saying that, oh, Jason Arday didn't have any sort of fraudulent claims made against him and it's all a witch hunt. And I have to remind people, saying, like, Ohio State University said they had no record of this man as a lecturer there. Like, can we just take a breath and stop lying? Like, this story didn't just come out of nowhere because a whole group of journalists decided to target a black professor. Like, there was some teeth to it. There were people that were being intimidated by this. You can acknowledge how bad the optics look and still acknowledge that there was something here that was of public interest. Now, I think, again, towards especially the sort of the last 2 weeks of coverage, I think it veered from public interest, but I think that was to do a lot with the media of the nature of the media ecosystem. And that's why, you even have people like Novara Media and The Guardian taking flack for this, because this was not a right-wing conspiracy. This was the media doing what it does. And it's not perfect, but I can't for the life of me think you're going to make things better by saying we should have less free speech and that we should neuter journalists. Who is going to win in that situation? I mean, I think you can argue sort of greater media responsibility, but again, who's supposed to argue that? Are the Metro and the Independent and the Telegraph and the Sun and all of these media organizations supposed to get together and say, hey, so we're going to coordinate in how we cover these topics because there's this one particular individual and we don't want their mental health to get so bad? That's not sustainable. That's not practical. And this is where duty of care comes in. Of course, in an ideal world, Cambridge and everyone else would have handled this a lot better, but we are where we are. So we cannot propose solutions that are impractical and go against the best interests of this country.
Also, because we've got this spectacle of the supposed anti-racist left who, on any given day, will talk about the British state is absolutely rotten and racist to its core. Now decides it wants the same British state to regulate the media. Like, this just doesn't really make any sense whatsoever.
And the international media, the New York Times, the Atlantic, it doesn't make any sense.
This is the ridiculous nature of it. This is assuming that the British state is clean.
Yeah, and it's also because one of the attack lines from the sort of hacked off pro-press regulation lobby would be that the media lies.
Yeah.
In this case, the media is being chided for telling the truth.
Yeah.
This is essentially, maybe there is arguments in there about what is and isn't public interest. That is ultimately for all editors and journalists to make up for themselves. I don't think that's something that could be decided from on high and, transmitted out to all of the media outlets. But at the same time, that is what is happening here. And the extent of the rewriting history is really stark. At that vigil the other night, the version of events that was laid out was essentially like this. Jason Arday was accused of plagiarism. He was cleared of plagiarism because of that quite cursory investigation that happened at Liverpool John Moores University. And then they just kept going at him and going at him and going at him and going at him and going at him until we all know what happened next. That is not what happened.
Yeah.
And there's something about this which I think is unfortunately completely free of any facts and genuine substance, is because it's been wrapped up in a narrative and that kind of BLM style, almost mystical reckoning that we're supposed to constantly be having with racism, which is forever hanging over our society. And therefore the facts go by the wayside. I mean, this was the religiosity of that vigil was something that really struck me. People were talking about how the media were dogs from hell,
Yeah.
and that the wicked, evil press had to be held to account. And this is just frankly, as I say, kind of quasi-religious in the fire and brimstone sense. I think it's completely taken leave of reason. I think it's also completely warping the whole argument around DEI. I mean, it's essentially being claimed off the back of this tragedy again that this is why you shouldn't criticize DEI, that to criticize DEI is the same as criticizing black people or suggesting that black people are incapable of being at university. The precise opposite. The whole ideology of DEI suggests that ethnic minority people are essentially incapable of thriving in public life unless the standards of public life are lowered to meet them. It's a really racist ideology. And going back to the Cambridge point, again, this idea that this was all about a vicious press that just couldn't stand the idea of a black person excelling and finding their way up in elite institutions. If you read the New York Times write-up of the whole sorry tale, which came out earlier this week, again, one of the most devastating accounts of it, it points out that when Arday was invited to be interviewed for the position, he was up against several people, many of which were not only more academically qualified than him, two of which were women of colour as well. Part of the reason they picked him was not just because of his identity, it was also because of what he said, his profile, the extent to which they felt that they could trade on a eye-grabbing new appointment with a tremendous backstory to boot. And this is what happens when you allow this ideology. It's about politics. It's not about skin colour. And what I think is happening, and I hate to say it, is that because I think a lot of people have realised that the whole kind of supposed anti-racism DEI agenda has taken some pretty bad knockbacks in recent years, that they're trying to recover ground off the back of this tragedy. And I think that's really, really outrageous. And for all the talk of us being the problem, for all the talk of the media being the people who are acting in a disreputable way, I cannot think of something more disreputable than that, like using a corpse as a soapbox in a way that many people are doing, either for press regulation or for trying to claw back some more legitimacy for a DEI ideology that we'd hope had not had its day, but at least was beginning to be on the way out.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Esther. That's all from the main Spike podcast. But if you're a Spike supporter, you can now join us over on Spike Podcast Unlocked.
We cannot figure out in the span of almost 20 years how to house our criminal population.
Relax about release of prisoners. Meanwhile, you're insisting at every turn that you have a glass of water on the London Underground, lest you get a little bit too overwhelmed.
Thank you so much for watching the Spike podcast. We'll be back next week, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you never miss an episode. If you enjoyed the Spike podcast, then why not check out what else our channel has to offer, from our documentaries to our weekly interviews and podcasts like The Brendan O'Neill Show. And if you're a Spike supporter, you can watch the second half of this episode by logging in on the Spike website. If you're not yet a Spike supporter, then why not sign up now? You'll get unlimited access to the website, ad-free reading, discounted tickets to our events, and so much more. So, become a Spike supporter today by going to spiked-online.com/support. That's spiked-online.com/support.